Special presentation. It's a 2-minute video, but I'm going to ask Adrienne, Clara, and Tavares to come up on stage. And while they come up, we are going to take a look at the story of how this piece came together. So it's going to be an exciting conversation. Thank you for being here, and we'll look forward to the conversation.
My interest in belonging has to do with an investigation of how we can claim our own space.
Belonging is really the essence or the core of what we're trying to achieve with the Social Justice Fund, because how can you feel that you belong if you don't have health justice, if you don't have access to capital, if you don't have education?
Clara and I met 4 years ago while I was an artist in residence at the Allens Institute, and we had several things in common. She was interested in art, science, and community. And those were three things that were central to my own practice. And so there was a ton of common ground there. And we became close friends, and we started to think about ways to work together.
When I first met Tavares, I was really interested in his entire profile. And I really felt that he was deeply original. He is a philosopher, a public intellectual of sorts, and to me, the artist of the future. After the protests that organically came to Brooklyn and the Barclays Plaza in the wake of George Floyd's murder, that's when we seized upon that moment. And I felt like it was the right place and the right time and the right moment and the right two people to make this happen.
I think that the location in and of itself became a very dynamic spot. You know, Barclays became this location for a lot of different social and community movements, right? And for me, I felt like this work was going to become a part of that fabric.
The piece of art is a jumping off point, right? And I really hope that it stimulates active dialogue among people who see it, and eventually result in some sort of connectedness or social cohesion. That would really be, for me, a sign that we've succeeded.
Good evening. Hi. I am so delighted to be here this evening with Clara and Tavares, and I want to say thank you all for coming out. For me, I think this is like maybe the second public talk that I've been to, so it's wonderful that we can all be in the room together again to celebrate this really incredible public artwork. And I'm just couldn't be happier, so thank you for having me. I wanted to kick things off with a question that comes from a 2017 work of Tavares's, and it was titled I Am, and I think you did it for Desert X.
Yeah.
And what I'd like is for you and Clara to each finish that phrase, I am.
Want me to go first? Do you want to? Okay, well, I could answer that so many ways, but I think in the context of this exhibition around belonging, I would say that I am connecting my past and my present and my future. And I say that because, you know, I grew up the daughter of immigrants from Taiwan, and they came to the US to get, well, my father's a professor at the University of Kansas and was there for 30 years. But when they came to this country, they came for economic opportunity, but they really also came for social justice, because when they grew up in Taiwan, it was occupied by Japan, and it was also under martial law. So when they came to the United States, they were really looking to live in a democracy. And I also grew up in the time where we were reciting for liberty and justice for all every day. And essentially, I feel that my work in social justice is really continuing the narrative and story of my parents.
That's going to be tough to follow. I am a Bahamian, was born in the Bahamas, and I find that to be really important in this moment when we're thinking a lot about representation. I find it to be really important in a moment where institutions are reconsidering how they're organizing themselves. For a long time, I didn't think there was a place for me. And so being able to just sit on stage and say, I am a Bahamian, and say it with pride and lean into it, means a whole lot for me and hopefully the people who come from the kinds of places that I come from.
Thank you, that was incredible. So let's get to it. I'm curious as to know how you two met and how this collaboration came about.
Okay, so Tavares and I met, I think about in 2018 at a World Frontiers Forum. It was a convening around art and science at Harvard. And I think Tavares was getting an award. And you know, as we mentioned, I love art, science, and community. And that's the space he works in. And so I knew that we would, we wanted to collaborate in some way. And so I went to Regan Projects. He had a exhibition. Then I went to visit his studio a few times. And I was really focused on a body of work that he had around making invisible heroes visible. Because for someone who also grew up, in Kansas, a woman of color, I have all these issues about being seen, right? So, of course, this body of work spoke to me, and I really wanted to do something around that. But instead, Tavares presented something else, which is the series of neon sculptures around You Belong Here, We Belong Here, and actually a third piece of it, I Belong Here. And it was early in our tenure here with the Nets and the Barclays Center and the Liberty. And so, it was sort of complicated to figure out the placement of a work like that. And it kind of didn't go anywhere. But then after the protests organically happened, I knew that it was the moment. And so I texted him and I said, this is the time. And that's when we, in earnest, started to make this happen.
I think what many people may not realize is that Tavares has done this sculpture in different places. I remember it from the 2014, I think it was, Prospect 3 that was curated by Franklin Sermons in New Orleans. But it was also in your Bahamian Pavilion, a different variation, but the language nonetheless, in the Bahamian Pavilion for the Venice Biennale in 2013. I think it's on the Momentary right now in Bentonville, Arkansas. What is this phrase for you? Why is this recurring in your work? I'm very curious, this theme of belonging, and who is the we? Who is the you? Where is the here?
I believe that at some point, we as a race of humans, the human race, will evolve to not need phrases like belonging and you belong here and we belong here. Until then, we have tons of artists who are gonna hold, hopefully, humanity to a higher standard, hold ourselves to a higher standard. I think, for me, this work is about provoking a series of questions. I think fundamentally, the premise of the work is about a collaboration with an artist and their audience, an artist and its community. And I think that those relationships are fundamentally important to me, specifically because for a long time, like I said earlier, I didn't necessarily feel like I belonged. And it takes a lot of gusto to get on stage and say it, but I think a lot of us feel this way, and it's hard for people to be able to articulate that. And fortunately, I along with Clara, were able to put this statement in the public in the public space, and there's a certain, I mean, all the artists in the room probably understand what I'm saying, but it really takes a lot to put oneself out into the world in these kinds of ways, and there's a certain level of vulnerability that goes along with it. I remember having painting shows when I was 17 years old, and I feel exactly the same butterflies in the stomach when something goes out to the public. And it doesn't really go away, you just kind of learn to live with it. And I think the experience of declaring your belonging in space or questioning it is a part of the process of being an artist. It's a creative process.
Who do you think is the audience for this work?
I'm gonna let Clara answer that one.
I mean, I think the audience is the public. For sure, you know, but I also have to say that, you know, for me, the audience really is myself. More and more as I reflect on this, and, you know, again, as I mentioned, there's actually 3 parts to this. It's actually I belong, you belong, we belong, and we had to pick 2 because there couldn't find a space for a 3rd. And I don't know, I think we thought about which 2 to do, but I'm really thinking a lot about the I belong here part. I think because to me, the I is about self-discovery and self-acceptance, and that I think is just as relevant as the discussion around you belong here and we belong here, you know, you being the individual and individual empowerment, and then, you know, the we being this collective belonging to something greater than ourselves. But I think 3 of them together are very powerful.
I mean, to add to that, I think there's so much work that's about how we're different. And I've always been curious about sameness. How are we the same? Where are those points, where are those touch points that we connect on? And so I think for me also, the question of audience has always been a curious thing to me. I mean, I'm from a place that has 350,000 people. It's 21 by 7. So I think that, you know, this question of audience is a profound question. But I think for me, there's something about sameness that I'm curious about, that we're both probing, right?
Yeah, I love, Clara, that you mentioned the I, because I first saw this piece maybe shortly after it went up. I was really late night in a taxi cab coming back from, I think maybe my first gala after the pandemic, and I was shocked. I just stopped because I could not believe that this was here in this place. And that's because I remember in May, I think it was like May 29th, watching the sort of protest happen, and sort of it started in Minneapolis, but as we all know, swelled to be across American cities, and indeed the world ultimately. And I remember making this choice really late one night watching CNN. Well, I guess I'm gonna go march. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and being really terrified about that. And I came right here. And when I saw that sign there, it took me back in a way that was deeply moving, and felt like the perfect response to something that had not been put in that language, right? It was not in the language of you belong here. And I just want to thank you for that on a deeply personal level. And it gets me back to this question of language in your work, Tavares. And also, did you know, Clara, that it was, how did you feel about the text piece? I'm just very curious about how you sort of decided that language was going to be the holder of all of these sentiments, and how you responded.
Yeah, I think language is not transparent. And I think that so much of how, as a youngster growing up, I was able to experience language was through music. And there's something about listening to rap and reggae lyrics that is about, becoming personified, being the character that the rappers, as you sing along, you become the character. And when you read a piece of text in public space, when you read it, you become a part of it. You have to say it in your mind. And I think there's something, for me, that's cathartic about that exercise, because as you read it, you say it, and you become a part of it the same way that you would music, rap lyrics. And I think that's a really important prompt for me, that when you see it, you read it, and as you read it, it becomes a part of your own lexicon.
I cannot believe you just said lexicon.
Sorry.
No, because last night I was at a dinner with Natalie Diaz, who is this incredible poet, indigenous poet, and she talks so much about lexicon being about sort of embodying sentiment. Like, language becomes this tool to actually use your body in a way to project what it is that you desire. And I cannot believe you used that word. Thank you. That's incredible. Please.
So, no, I didn't know it was going to be a text-based work, but I think a large neon text-based work is perfect for this site. Well, first of all, I think that the script is beautiful, right? So it really isn't just any text. It's very beautiful to look at, especially the W. That's one of the reasons we didn't do I. I think the I is not as pretty as the W. But I think that, when I think about doing public art, I want it to be visible, and I want the message to be clear. And when you think about Barclays Plaza, look, we're at the intersection of Flatbush and Atlantic, and there's so much commotion going on. So, when you think about visibility and people getting the message, I think this is actually brilliant. And I think that the placement, the neon, the colors, the script, I think work perfectly. And one more point about the text, I actually think it being text is maybe an easier point of entry too, for people, because really what we want is for people to engage with it. You say they read it and they embody it, but it's also a way of saying that more people maybe will engage with it because it is text.
I'm curious about, there's something so fundamental to the way you both move in the world that is about questions of inequity, art, social impact. I think you call it social works, Tavares. And you work in history and technology and science, and these things kind of converge between the two of you.
Artistic practice is about making space. You think of the experience of a sculptor or a painter or someone making installation, you think about this kind of the idea of making space physically, but also I think there's a kind of social space that I think people are yearning for. I think for a kid like me to be able to claim the name artist, to claim the title artist, when prominent museums 25, 30 years ago wouldn't consider someone who was like me, coming from the background that I came from, an artist, it's kind of a very important space to claim. And so for many artists that I look up to in many genres, again, going back to music, thinking about jazz, thinking about reggae, thinking about hip hop, thinking about the early days of those movements, they weren't necessarily considered artists at all. And a huge part of their practice was about creating the room where the language could exist for them to be even considered artists, right? I mean, I think it was Jay-Z who won his first Grammy but couldn't go on stage to get it because that wasn't what the Grammys were allowing rappers to do at the time. And now he's Jay-Z, right? And so I think making space, like having that elbow room, creating elbow room for you to just be an artist in the first place is profoundly important. And I think a huge part of that is significant and not necessarily separate from the manufacturing of artwork, right? It's essential.
That's interesting. You just being is sort of this act of social justice. I think art can change the way people think and feel. It changes the way we feel about ourselves and how we think about other people. And so in that way, it really is a catalyst for change. And I think this piece of work, I hope that it will commemorate what happened in 2020. The protests about the senseless death of George Floyd, and I hope that it will, induce dialogue about what it means to belong and why it's important. And belonging really is the anthem, though, to our social justice work. And in particular, we just really want to point out the fact that equity is such an important part of people feeling like they belong.
I want to pick up on that anthem part, because we're in this moment of it's real questioning around public monuments. It's been going on now for quite a while. And I wanted to think about this work as something that's monumental. It's quite large. I don't know what the dimensions are, but it's quite large. But it seems to me that you're putting forth an idea about not a monument, actually, but an anthem. Do you see it that way? Like, how might those two things operate differently? I think you even talk about anthem in relationship to your art.
I think it's really important. My first encounter with storytelling, it actually comes from being 8 years old in the Bahamas, listening to reggae. And the reason why that's important is because the information that I was getting at school, I was learning about Columbus. And Columbus didn't look like me, it had nothing to do with me, but I knew way more about Columbus than anybody else. And then I would go home, and in the neighborhood, they would be playing Burning Spear and Luciano and Cable, and all these artists were just dropping knowledge on a lot of the histories that have been kind of hidden away from us. And so music became a really beautiful backdrop for me to think about my own practice. And so, for example, I wouldn't know who Marcus Garvey was without music, because the first time I heard who Marcus Garvey was, and by the way, Marcus Garvey, for anyone in the room who doesn't know, is probably one of the most important people of the past 100 years. And I had to learn about Marcus Garvey through music. And so when I hear you say anthem, it really hits me, because it goes back to that place. It's the kind of root of all of how I think about processing information. It's a beautiful, like the script, music is this kind of lovely delivery system for an idea, for a story. And having this particular story or these curiosities about belonging live in this way as an anthem is actually a really nice way to think about it.
Okay.
Will you say something about the script, actually?
I really like it.
I hope so.
Now, so it's a hybrid of a calligraphy script that I adopted when I was young. I think I was telling you this maybe a couple days ago. When I was in the 8th grade, my teacher taught me calligraphy, and I wanted things like most kids, and so I developed a side business making wedding invitations for people. And so the way that the script kind of developed was a kind of hybrid of the calligraphy that I was learning as a kid, and just combining that with some newer type faces that existed. But I think the point of it was, who would have thought that this script that I was treating as a way to get shoes is now outside of Barclays.
It's pretty cool. it occurred to me that, Clara, you could have easily have installed this piece inside Barclays Center, but you didn't. And I'm just curious how you came to the decision that it should be in public, as a public art.
Yes, it was always intended to be public art. And I never would have thought about putting it in Barclays Center. But the truth is, it did come up because, as you can imagine, once we started deciding that we were going to put this up, there were all these constraints around permitting and approvals. And that was a lengthy process, actually. And so we were kind of trading off speed of getting it up with applying for permits. And so somebody said, well, why don't we just, there's a great place downstairs in the Calvin Klein Club or something. And I just thought, oh, no. This is not, the we is not people that are in Barclays to see a game or a show. The we is the public. And I really, in my mind, it was always somebody coming out of the subway or walking by and unexpectedly running into this and thinking about all these questions for themselves. So it was really always meant to be a public work, and it would not nearly be as powerful if it weren't where it is.
I have a question for you, Adrienne.
You're not the moderator, Tavares.
I know.
So Tavares and I have this relationship where he tries to instigate things. It's not going to happen, Tavares.
I just got
I'll
one
take
question.
one. Okay.
One question.
Okay, fine. I'll take one.
I feel like there's this general idea that in the moment that we're in, the world is on unstable ground. As someone you work in the arts, you've worked in the arts the entire time I've known you. What do you believe that the role of art is in this moment? Let me just add one more thing to that. I think.
Please.
Now, I think just to give some context, I think the reason why I asked that question is because there's a sense that art is the last thing you need when the world becomes unstable. So I want to hear your thoughts on just.
Well, I fundamentally believe the world is precarious and unstable, and that's the reality of our lives, right? And oftentimes we're unwilling to admit. We had this incredible conversation the other day where it's impossible for us, I feel like as a human species, to admit the fact of our reality, right? And so we're also in this moment, I might add, of a real desire for certitude, right? Like people are hungry, desperate, need some sense of security right now, maybe more, or we have an awareness of it that is more intense now than before. And I really believe that that impossibility puts pressure on us to kind of get right, to get okay with that uncertainty. And where I'm going with this is that the most important thing is to actually ask the question, that we are constantly, relentlessly asking a question. So it's like, oh, it should be this way. This is my given. This is what I think this should be. This is the way I think this is where I think this should take place, or this is any assumption. We should immediately then say, why? Why do I feel that? Why does it have to be this way? Why do I hold these beliefs that something has to be authentic? And I think to relentlessly ask questions is the most important thing right now. For me, this is how I'm getting through a lot that I'm confronting. Yeah.
We didn't argue, see?
We didn't. It flowed really nicely. Okay, so maybe one last question. It's kind of, where do you go from here? It's, how long will the piece be up? You said something really beautiful, Clara, that I was so struck by, which is that you see Barclays as a cultural institution. And I'm really curious about what that means for you, because it's actually a really powerful way to think about this place.
Yeah, I think of Barclays as a cultural institution, and I also think of it as a civic institution. And I think that arts, sports, culture foster community, and that's kind of where I see this role. Barclays is already a civic center of sorts. You know, we have food drives here. We were a polling place, a vaccination site. Public assemblies are here. So I just think that adding some culture or adding art such as this one that really involves and stimulates the community is just another way to foster civic connection. And we're really committed to our civic role. So I see art as being a real integral part of that.
Thank you. Thank you both.